Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo DeVos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the For Food's Sake podcast. This week we talk to Dr. David Montgomery. David is a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington in Seattle. He's also an internationally recognized geologist and the author of award-winning popular science books including Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations. Dave's latest book, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, which came out this year, makes a strong and convincing case to make agriculture sustainable by embracing a system of conservation agriculture. That is to say, a system in which we ditch the plow, cover the soil, and diversify using crop rotations. Now, in this podcast, we'll delve into exactly what that means and why it's so important to make soil health the center of what farming and agriculture is all about. We'll talk about why agriculture as we know it is inherently destructive, how both the problem in agriculture and the revolution that we need goes beyond the traditional divisions between conventional farming and organic farming. That is to say that neither organic nor conventional agriculture necessarily has the solutions in and of themselves to current problems that we face in agriculture. We'll also talk about how conservation agriculture has been proven to work for all sorts of farms, whether it's conventional or organic, or smaller or larger farms, both with livestock and without. That there's not necessarily one solution or one solution fits all, and that there's definitely no silver bullet when it comes to fixing the agricultural system that we currently have. We'll finish by touching upon some of the limitations that we currently have to reaching such a model, some of the difficulties that we're facing, and how we could potentially overcome them. All right, so without further preamble, I bring you Dr. David Montgomery. Dave, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Hey, sure, no problem. Happy to be here.
So I just finished reading your new book, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, in which you make a really convincing case, I find, for an agricultural revolution that centers very much around soil health. You talk about how farmers need to acknowledge and at the same time combat the way that current conventional chemical-intensive agriculture degrades soil health, and how we need to really move away from this model that focuses only on yields, obsessively focuses on yields, and instead move towards a system of conservation agriculture that focuses on building healthy soils. And so I thought we could talk a little bit more about those ideas that you discuss in your book, and for me also about the optimistic message that you have, and how this new system can really provide a new approach to combating climate change. But there's obviously a lot to unpack, and for people that aren't maybe so familiar with a lot of the concepts I just mentioned, I thought we could start with the basics, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you mean by healthy soils, or about soil in general. I mean, what do we mean when we talk about soil?
Yeah, soil is I like to think of it as one of the most critical resources that humanity depends on, that we don't think about and that we don't care about and that we don't try and conserve and protect at anywhere near the level that its importance would warrant. And we take it for granted. We tend to think of soil as dirt. It's the stuff that's underfoot. It's stuff plants grow in, but it's so much more than that in terms of, if you think about it, I like to think about it in terms of a planetary scale. Mm-hmm. You can think of soil as quite literally the skin of the earth. It's the outer shell of rotten rock that's mixed with organic matter, the biology that makes this planet, as far as we know, unique. And it's that combination of biology and geology that really makes soil fertile and able to help support the growth of future plants. You could also think of soil as nature's recycling system and nutrient provisioning system all rolled into one. There's lots of different ways to think about it, but most people don't really put much thought into soil, let alone the soil that their food came from. And it turns out that it matters not just at a societal level, which I wrote about in my first book, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, that looked at the way that people treated their land, how that in turn set up how the land treated their descendants. And there's some pretty sobering stories in there of civilizations that degraded their land to the point that it really still impoverishes their descendants centuries later. And we just simply can't afford to do that at a planetary scale. And if you look at, what are our options? Going to Mars to farm? Well, no. You look at what the nature of the surface material there is. It's not soil. It doesn't have the biology. And it's kind of like the chemistry of battery acid. It's not going to be great, even if Matt Damon gets up there and tries to play with agriculture. So if we look at the future of humanity on this planet, we need to basically be able to feed ourselves. We need air, we need water, we need food. Those are the basics, right? And we need company. We're social animals. We need each other. Right. And it's the importance of soil for growing our food that tends to get left off the sort of the big strategic list of what are the important things to conserve this century. So far, the estimates are that we've degraded about a third of our agricultural land worldwide. And if you think about that, that's a pretty significant accomplishment in a pretty short period of geologic time, but it doesn't work towards sustaining our presence on the planet. It works towards the opposite. And at the pace that we're going now, there was a UN report that just came out a couple years back, 2015, I think it was, that estimated that we're losing another 0.3% of our food producing capacity, our agricultural capacity, each and every year to degradation and erosion of the soil. And, that number is kind of pretty small, right? 0.3%. It's kind of like what we're all getting on our savings accounts or something these days. It's not really that significant, not a big number year to year. But you play it out over 100 years, and that means that we're on track today to degrade another third of our agricultural production capacity, which means that by the end of this century, by 2100, we could be set up to have lost more than half of the world's agricultural capacity at a time when our population is going to be getting bigger. And so I sort of view the problem of feeding the world in agriculture not just through the lens of growing high crop yields today, but how are we going to be able to sustain growing enough food through the future, particularly if we're looking at a world in which climate change is going to complicate things, if we're looking at a world in which fossil fuels will in all probability become much rarer and more expensive over time, let alone whether or not they're wise to use. We need to think of ways to change our agriculture so that we reverse this long-term historical pattern and ongoing pattern of land degradation. And that got me into thinking about, well, how can we restore soils? Could we actually turn around this ancient pattern? And I started thinking about that quite literally in my own yard, because my wife is a gardener. And we bought a house in North Seattle where I live. I teach at the University of Washington in what used to be the geology department. And we bought a house that had a side yard that was a lawn. And Anne wanted a garden, so we ripped the lawn off, and we found that we had absolutely terrible soil. We pretty much had dirt, actually. There were no worms in it, not a single worm, very few life forms. It was not very productive. And she took it on herself to try and bring that soil back to life and to essentially grow the garden that she desired. She had to start with fixing the soil. And I was amazed at how fast she was able to do that. Within just a few years, within about 5 years, we were seeing big changes in the soil. And it's pretty much due to adding organic matter. Leaves, compost, coffee grounds from the coffee shops down the street, zoo doo from the composted herbivore turds from the local zoo that really wanted to get rid of the stuff. So they bring your truck up, you can take it away. Within a short amount of time, we'd actually completely turned around the nature and quality of our soil to the point where we've now parked tons of carbon in our yard because all that organic matter, when it gets consumed by microorganisms and turned into new life, its fate is eventually going towards building up soil organic matter and helping plants recycle the dead remains of their colleagues into the building blocks for new life. And that happened so fast that I was really impressed. We wrote up The Hidden Half of Nature, a book that describes that process and the parallels with what goes on actually in the human gut, which surprised us. But the relationships between the microbes in the soil and the microbes in the human gut, their relationships to their hosts, to plants and to people, are remarkably parallel. Putting those ideas into practice and asking the question, well, could we restore farmland at a global scale? Could you take these ideas that worked in this little corner of North Seattle where we live? can you scale them up? Do they work? So I went around and visited farmers around the world for about 6 months, looking at farmers who had already restored fertility to their land and trying to look at what are the commonalities, what are the principles behind what they were doing. And the commonalities were actually pretty clear. The practices were different in different parts of the world. You wouldn't use the same farming practices, say, in equatorial Ghana as you would in South Dakota. But the principles that underlay what actually made for a regenerative agriculture, an agriculture that would rebuild the health and fertility of the soil as a consequence of intensive farming, and thereby allow farmers to use far less agrochemicals, those principles are pretty constant. They're pretty consistent. And I came away actually very optimistic that we could turn around this long-term problem of soil degradation. A, because I'd seen farmers actually do it. So it wasn't a theory. It's not some guy in the ivory tower going, hey, maybe we could do this. It was real farmers who had already done it. And I went to ask them how they did it. And, brought a shovel along and dig a hole in their fields, look at their soils, look at their neighbor's soil, and try and, back out what had actually happened and what the generalized principles were. I came away really optimistic that not only could this be done, but it could be done in remarkably short order, and it could be done profitably because the farmers were benefiting themselves. Because with healthier, more fertile soil, they didn't need as much fertilizer. They didn't need as many pesticides. They didn't drive their tractors as much, so they burned less diesel. All those things add up to positive changes for the farm's bottom line. But it's one of these rare, I think, win-wins where something is not only economically viable, but it is much better environmentally. I came away very impressed and excited about the potential for a soil health-based revolution in agriculture, because I think we now understand enough to know why it could work, and enough people have been implementing these ideas to show that it can work, and it pencils out economically, which means that maybe it'll spread.
Yeah, I really appreciated the way you went to different parts of the world, and like you said, you found obviously adapted to different contexts, but the same kind of principles being laid out, and what you called it in the book, and I think this is, I guess, common terminology is very much conservation agriculture, right? So this idea, this three-pronged approach, you ditch the plow, you use cover crops, and you rotate your crops. Could you, especially with ditch the plow, but with all three of those concepts, could you explain that a little more? Because I think for people that aren't so familiar with these concepts, the idea of ditching the plow, the idea of no-till agriculture, no-till farming just sounds absurd.
Right, because what's the first thing you think of when you think of farming? You think of a plow, right?
Right.
Go look at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. On the seal, the sort of official logo of it, it's got Thomas Jefferson's plow on it. And so, yeah, those three principles, the ditch the plow, cover up with cover crops, and grow a diversity of crops, really represent a complete reversal of how we've tended to think about conventional farming for the last 100 years. We've tended to think in terms of intensive tillage and plowing. And why is that done? As weed control and to help prepare a seed bed. And because we've always done it. And then in terms of, we also have been using fertilizers and agrochemicals to essentially feed plants as opposed to using cover crops to bring organic matter back to the soil. And we've focused on growing one or two crops, functional monocultures, rather than diverse communities of crops. So those ideas of ditch the plow, cover up with cover crops, and grow diversity is a real 180-degree reversal of some very conventional thinking. But it's not equivalent to going organic. And those principles work as well to help build soil fertility in organic systems as they do in conventional systems. So it's a style of thinking about the soil that needs to shift to build soil health. So why do those three principles actually build soil health when you practice them together? That's probably the real key question that underpins the whole book. And the short answer to that is that those practices together help cultivate the beneficial life in the soil that is benefiting plant growth and health, helping to get those mineral elements out of the soil particles, getting them into the plants, helping to build the soil structure that allows the water to sink down into the root zone where the plants can then take it up. And those microorganisms make an incredible array of compounds that are of direct benefit to the plants, not necessarily nutritional, but that essentially help provide their chemical defense systems, sort of support their equivalent of an immune system. And so why do each of those practices work that way? Well, with ditching the plow, I mean, if you think about what could be more disruptive to your own life than someone once a year or so, or even 2 or 3 times a year, taking a giant metal spoon, opening the roof of your house, and stirring the contents of your home. This would be very disruptive. And the soil's got, that's what a plow does to soil life. You're basically completely mixing up and chopping up the habitat for those organisms. So think if you're an earthworm living in the top 6 inches in the soil when somebody comes through with a plow. You may not end the day in the same number of pieces as you started the day in. And so tillage, plowing, is very disruptive to soil life. It can also help crust over the surface of the soil, which will prevent water from infiltrating into it, or sinking into it, which means more water will run off over the surface and not get to the roots where the plants want them. And instead, it'll run off carrying fertilizers and other things to the nearest stream and creating off-site pollution and problems. And that one's a little counterintuitive, but the science is there to back that up, that if you pulverize the crust of the soil with a plow, you break it up into sort of a fine powder, you'd think water would sink into it. But what happens is the first rain that falls on it crusts over the surface, and then no more water the water that comes second can't actually sink into the ground.
Right.
So you lose as a farmer. So there's these biological and physical reasons why not plowing actually helps to build the structure of a soil that helps plants grow, but it also helps provide the habitat for the microbial partners, the bacteria and fungi, that are actually working with plants to grow a healthy plant. And the eye-opener to Ann and I in writing The Hidden Half of Nature before we got into Growing Our Evolution was that plants will push out of their root system sometimes 30 to 40% of the material they photosynthesize. They'll push out of their roots. So we know that plants can take carbon dioxide and water and combine it through photosynthesis to make carbohydrates, the building blocks of plants, simple sugars. But very few of us, I think, know that plants will also push 30% of that stuff out of their roots and into the soil. And that just makes no sense when you think about it from like an economic perspective. How many of us take 30% of our salary and go throw it on a street corner somewhere? No. But what does happen with that kind of a percent of a lot of our salaries? We pay taxes. It goes to a broad society as a whole, who then spends it on things we may or may not like them to spend it on. But we have realized that there's a point to that. We get functional roads, we get trains that run, we get these things that we value as a community. And that's essentially what's happening with those carbohydrates and proteins that plants are pushing out of their roots into the soil. They're feeding microbial partners in the soil who do other things that help the plant that the plant can't do for itself. It helps them acquire nutrients, particularly mineral micronutrients. The organisms in the soil will make metabolites. They'll eat those exudates from out of the plant roots, and they metabolize them into their own sort of microbial manure, if you will, that are all these compounds that plants take up and use for defensive purposes. Things like, or even their own growth, things like plant growth promoting hormones. So you've got bacteria in the soil making hormones to make plants grow big. These kind of partnerships are things that 30 years ago would have been called crazy talk, but we now know that they underpin a good part of soil fertility, and practices like intensive tillage, a lot of plowing, undermines those connections and that foundation. It breaks up the mycorrhizal fungi, the fungi that link the mineral particles to the plants, and serve as the conduit for nutrition to plants. In terms of cover crops, a big part of what cover crops do is they prevent erosion. And if you're looking at how to build healthy, fertile soil, you don't do it by eroding it, because when you erode soil, you're eroding off the top. And that's where most of the organic matter, where most of the fertility is. So you're losing the best stuff first. So to basically build healthy, fertile soil and keep it over the long run, you got to shut erosion, not off, but way down. And cover crops are a good way to do that. What they also do is they add organic matter, and that organic matter is the stuff that feeds the microbes. It's the currency of the underground economy. It's what the organisms in the soil are consuming organic matter, or each other, and turning them into organic matter. And then their waste products, their metabolites, are rich in those nutrients that those once living things had, but they're then available for plants to take back up. So by adding organic matter, you're feeding the recyclers in the soil what they need to then feed the plants on the back end of the cycle of life. And the diversity of crops part of it is part about suppressing pests and pathogens. Because if you plant corn in a field year after year, what you are doing is you're basically opening a grocery store for things that eat corn. And if they lay their eggs in a cornfield and next year you plant corn, you're going to get things that eat corn sprouting in your field, and you've basically just set the table for them. If you plant a diversity of crops in an unpredictable order, 3, 4, 5 crops in an order that's not predictable so that the organisms can adapt readily, you can really break up the pest and pathogen carryover problem, which really reduces the need for pesticides. And it also, if you have a diverse set of, say, cover crops or a diverse set of crops in a crop rotation, they will be bringing nutrients in from different levels in the soil, some with deep roots from the subsoil, some from the topsoil, and sort of a recipe for actually building soil health. You adopt all 3 practices, the no-till, the cover crops, and the diverse rotation, and you can see big changes in the soil occur in just a few years. And as a geologist, changing your soil in less than 10 years is something that, to me, is really fast. It's remarkably fast. And that's where visiting farmers who had done this and seen, dramatic changes over the course of a decade or two, that's a way to radically reshape farming in a time frame that could make a big difference, not just on feeding the world of tomorrow, but it could actually contribute to sequestering carbon, because all that organic matter, putting that in the soil, that's putting carbon in the soil. And the practices that we would adopt to promote soil health and fertility by bringing soil organic matter contents up, those are the same kind of practices that work for for sequestering carbon in the soil.
But the key is very much that you have all 3 working together, right? Because I think one of the things you see, for example, historically, is that at least cover crops and the rotation of crops was very much the norm, at least, pre-1950s, pre-Second World War. But we had the aspect of, tillage still in place. And I think a lot of people now today as well, I think maybe one of their main fears, which I'd also like to hear your opinion on when it comes to tillage, is, they think of tillage very much as the way to suppress weeds. So, again, I think this comes back to the idea of using all 3 together so that the weeds don't kind of dominate. But I think that's where a lot of people get scared. And I think that's also where you have, big agricultural firms. I'm thinking here, Monsanto, for example, are very much, jumping on the no-till bandwagon, so to speak, and promoting it alongside their, Roundup ready herbicides and or glyphosate. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right on those points. So I can elaborate a bit. One of the ironies of the value of no-till for reducing erosion and promoting soil health is that one of the key things that really has fostered the growth of no-till over the last few decades, such that in the United States, for example, something like a quarter to a third of our cropland is now is no-till. One of the things that really facilitated that was the development of herbicides for weed control, because tillage was a very traditional method to control weeds. It's very good at that. You turn the surface of the earth over, and what was growing on it isn't there anymore. And so you can then plant your seeds, and if your seeds come up first, hey, they win the race to the sun, and the farmer's happy. So, weed control is one of those really important issues that has been there for a long time, and is one of the reasons why tillage, or some form of it, was practiced, in many societies around the world. The development of herbicides and then GMO seeds that were able to tolerate those herbicides made weed control really easy, because you could plant your specialty seeds and then you just spray everything and it would kill everything but your crop. That really encouraged the adoption of no-till, because it made it easy. And what I found when I visited farmers around the world is that there's other methods of weed control that farmers that are really interested in building in soil health building practices are starting to practice. And some of those involve cover crops in terms of the ecological management of cover crops. So the time of year you plant them, which species you plant. You can plant like low growing cover crops. So when your corn gets above the cover crop, the corn wins. The cover crop then gets compromised and then, eventually dies, and its nutrients get recycled. So it then becomes a green manure. It becomes fertilizer. Other ways to manage cover crops are without herbicides are things like a crop roller. I visited the Rodale Institute, an organic agriculture institute in Pennsylvania, who are really sort of at the leading edge of trying to apply these ideas in organic farm settings. And they have a crop roller that's basically like a steamroller drum with big metal chevrons that are like blades that stick off of it that you put on the front of a tractor. You could put a no-till planter on the back of the tractor, put this crop roller on the front, and you just mow down your cover crops before they go to seed. Because if they go to seed, they become weeds, right? You want to kill them before they reproduce, so you control what goes in there. So you mow down the cover crops with this crop roller, and it knocks them down and then crimps the stems, which kills the plant, and turns it into a mulch. And then you plant through the mulch with your no-till planter. You don't need any herbicide because you've basically done weed control with the roller crimper. I've also run into farmers, though, that I wrote about that are using livestock as ways to terminate their cover crops. So instead of spraying it with a poison with an herbicide or rolling it with a roller crimper, they let their cows loose on their corn stalks or their soybean residue or their other vegetable crop residues and let the livestock consume it, turn it into manure, which is then recycling the nutrients. So there's other ways than herbicides to actually go no-till. But ironically, it was the development of herbicides that helped no-till practices spread because it provided a different way of weed control. But we're now at the point where we have alternatives to that can work just as well, that people are starting to realize that with a simple practice, rather than paying somebody for a product, they can actually achieve the same kind of result. So you were basically also mentioning that cover crops and crop rotations are old ideas. That's exactly right. I mean, that's ancient wisdom right there. These are things that societies around the world have discovered were beneficial for maintaining the fertility of their land. Again, because they worked. If you have more organic matter, you grow a diversity of crops, you will then have healthier soil, which will give you healthier crops. Farmers around the world independently learned this in Asia, in Africa, in Europe. But what has compromised long-term agricultural stability in society after society was the soil erosion that resulted from tillage. So what I like to think about is that the opportunity that we have today in trying to talk about a soil health revolution is that if we think about those three principles that underpin conservation agriculture and their application to building healthy, fertile soils, we're taking the best of ancient wisdom, the cover crops and the crop rotations, and we're trying to couple it with the best of modern technology, which is our new and different ways to actually practice weed control that don't rely on the plow and that need not rely on herbicides. And if we take that sort of the best of modern science and the best of ancient wisdom and put them together, we've kind of defined this new sort of way of looking at conservation agriculture or regenerative agriculture. And we could even start thinking about the value of bringing livestock back onto farms as a part of a new system of farming that can help rebuild the health and fertility of our land. And we're really at a point in human history where we've got to do it. We simply can't continue degrading land the way we have been in the past if we expect our descendants to be able to make their living off the land. And I haven't seen any viable alternatives, so we need to basically make this transition. And I'm really happy to report that in the farmers that I visited, those who had already done it and had rebuilt the health and fertility of their land, their yields didn't go down. So it's not a question of feeding the world better food versus starving. It's their yields were maintained or went up, and their expenses went down. They spend less on fertilizer, they spend less on diesel, they spend less on herbicides and pesticides, and that means the farmers end up with more money in their pocket. They're more profitable, and that's a recipe for wider adoption. And so that's where I sort of turned from a bit of a pessimist after writing the Dirt book to a genuine optimist after writing Growing a Revolution, is that I see a path forward where these ideas could spread and they can work on both conventional farms and they can work on organic farms, so that whole argument of conventional versus organic, I can basically argue that all farms need to adopt this style of soil health building practices. And if they did, conventional practices would become, as I put it in the book, more organic-ish, because they just wouldn't rely on as many agrochemicals. And that if we could change modern conventional farming into organic-ish farming, it would literally change the world. And organic farmers could also benefit. Some organic farmers and biodynamic farmers have already adopted all these principles. They're already on board. Not all of them, though. There's some really big organic farms that are still involve a lot of tillage. And I could show you farms where the regenerative farmer next door who uses a little bit of chemicals has much better quality soil than an organic farm that plows a lot. So it's not sort of a simple one-dimensional problem. And the practices you'd use in Ohio or the Dakotas or Ghana or Costa Rica, all these places I visited, they're different in each of those regions. These principles have to be adapted to the local terrain, to the local soil, to the climate, to the crops people are growing, to the culture of what people want to grow, the practices that they have, and to their technological levels, their access to capital. All these things matter. But farming that adheres to these broad principles of soil health building practices really should be the wave of the future.
Yeah, I really agree. And I think one of the things that I particularly picked up upon in your book in terms of, how do we transition, which I found really interesting. You mentioned, at least from the farmer's perspective, it makes economic sense, makes sense in terms of time. They just spend less time, tilling since there's no tilling. But there was also a very important point that you made about overcoming a culture, not just, among farmers, but I guess among development agencies and government agencies of seeing whether it's organic or crop rotations or this new approach as being primitive and something that we can't feed the future with, the people of the future with, because it'll never meet the yields, even though that's been proven wrong. And that they're very much looking for, these agencies are looking for, these quick fix breakthrough silver bullets, and that it's a matter, I guess, of convincing people that it's gradual, well, not even gradual change, because this can happen quite quickly, but that it's not one solution, whether it's, pumping CO2 down into old gold mines, but that it's, across the board in agriculture all around the world, that you can start storing carbon and change farming that way.
Yeah, that's you got your finger right on it. I mean, that's what this system of principles do is they give us a framework, what I like to think of as a new philosophy of farming, a new intellectual framework to think about our practices and how to frame what's the smart way to go forward. And the difference between sort of a practice in that sense and a product is very fundamental to the way that aid agencies work and to the way that agribusiness works and to the way farming today tends to work globally. Because if you look at what actually supports the advice to farmers, the research on what to do on farms, a lot of it is focused around developing new products that can be sold to farmers.
Yeah.
Whereas what we're talking about with conservation agriculture is a new system of practices that can be taught to farmers. You don't have to buy anything to do it, although you may have to buy new equipment if you say you change from a plow to no-till. There's capital costs, and John Deere would be happy to sell you a no-till planter. I mean, they make them because people will buy them. And I think that if farmers change their practices, people will still be selling farmers things. There will always be a farm supply business, but the nature of what's being sold and supplied may change. And so you have this, who is basically speaking up for the changes in practice that don't involve selling a farmer something. I've seen a lot of the momentum for this soil health building movement come out of farming communities themselves, because it's through peer-to-peer contact of farmers who've adopted these practices, found that they work, and that if they can change their thinking and the way they run their farm, their practices, their habits, if you will, they can have a very beneficial effect not only on their land but on their bottom line. There's not a lot of folks involved in sort of thinking about the large-scale future of agriculture that are focused on the systems level kind of change and thinking. There's, as you put it, there's a lot of focus on silver bullets. We can engineer a new crop that will solve that problem. We can create a new herbicide that'll solve that problem. But there's a lot of room for creative thinking about how to apply these kind of general soil building principles to the applied problem of farming that could help across the board. There's a lot of room for research. There's a lot of room for demonstration farms. There's a lot of room for trial and error. But it can be challenging to get programs to actually think about adopting a different way of thinking about a system as the foundation for new practices going forward. Our agricultural research enterprise tends to focus on sort of small-scale fixes and tinkering with the existing system rather than reconceiving the philosophical foundation for it and going, oh, what does this mean about, which of these practices should we be doing? And that's where I think that the idea of a soil health revolution really lies, because if we think about evaluating agronomic practices, farming practices through the lens of do they build soil health or do they degrade soil health? If that's kind of our metric, it'll start moving us in the right direction, and we'll really emphasize the viability of changes in practices to do things to make transformative change that isn't going to happen through a continual incrementalizing change in products and that we can sell that someone can sell to farmers.
And that's why I think it's so important that it's bottom up, because like we mentioned, it's not at the moment, it doesn't seem something that's commercially attractive to big ag firms, because at the end of the day, we're big, fertilizers that are, they're the ones making the money in the current system, right? They're the ones selling to farmers the fertilizers that are, definitely not making farmers rich, let's put it that way. But this is, I think, also where you talked in your book about crop insurance and government subsidies is an enormous problem, because it inhibits, it doesn't exactly encourage farmers to think outside of the box, because they essentially have an insurance policy that allows them to have crops that fail.
Yeah, I sort of think back to the example of my own sort of courses that I teach, whereas if we had, final exam insurance, where you could, if you bomb the final exam, you still get a B. I'm not sure how many of the students would actually study because they'd have a pretty easy backstop. Right. And what I found in terms of enthusiasm for farmers today is rooted for these practices is rooted in the problem that they've been kind of squeezed for the last few decades between their great success at their ability to grow large crops of food, large harvests, and that drives down the price they get for what they do grow, because they grow a surplus of it. And at the same time as as prices for what they get have been dropping, the cost of inputs they depend on in conventional farming, the fertilizers, the pesticides, the patented seeds, those have not been going down. They've been going up quite rapidly. And so all the farmers that I talked to felt quite squeezed in between those two great forces. And it's intriguing that, when you're caught in a system like that, the people selling you products are making money just fine, and the people buying your produce are doing just fine. But the farmers have been squeezed, and you can see that in what's happened to family farms across North America and probably other parts of the world as well. But what farmers actually have the ability to do, the lever that they have, is to change their practices. They don't need anyone's permission to do that. They just need the guts to actually make the change and to try it. And very few people are willing to do a radically risky thing with their livelihood. Some people do, but not many. We tend to be fairly conservative with that. But if you see your neighbors and your colleagues, or if there's a demonstration farm that's actually shown that these new practices work, the barrier towards adopting those practices gets lower with each new sort of example and success, each farmer-to-farmer contact. So I see a lot of bottom-up momentum for these ideas. They could surely use some top-down watering from the policy world. And as you were pointing out, crop insurance is a great place to start with that. We should be subsidizing farmers not to continue practices that degrade the land. We should be subsidizing farmers to convert to practices that build up society's long-term ability to maintain that farmland in production, that rebuild the health and fertility of the land. That's what we should be subsidizing. And the beautiful part about if we switched our subsidy system to promote building soil health is that eventually, if we can rebuild the health and fertility of the world's farmlands, we won't need so many subsidies. Right. It's a self-limiting process. and we'll always, I think, need some kind of a backstop for farmers. We need them to stay in business as a global enterprise. But there's a different way of thinking about how to do that that's starting to emerge. I'd love to see a lot more policy discussion. I'd love to see more demonstration farms. But there's some very active farmers who are engaged in trying to teach their colleagues why it is these practices worked for them on their farms and how they could pick up similar ideas and transform their own lives.
There's one group of people that we haven't talked about yet, though, and that's what I always try and bring my podcast back to, and that's where I think this issue is really complicated, and that's consumers. Like, how do we, what role do we have to play here? Because organic definitely doesn't go far enough, because you have organic till farms that don't support the long-term, health of soils. And it's not, as far as I'm aware, there's no, healthy soil label out there currently that, allows consumers to just buy and create more demand. So what's our role as consumers?
Yeah, there's discussions and moves towards creating some kind of a regenerative farming label that consumers could look at point of purchase. But, what actually is behind that label is sort of still being discussed and argued, and it would be really important to see where it lands. But that is a really big, important question in terms of, first of all, should consumers care? If you're not concerned about the longevity of civilization, say, should you still care? Because astoundingly, not everyone is. But there's a very simple connection, and that question centers on: do regenerative practices that can help restore fertility to the land, do they also grow better food? Do they grow food that's more nutrient rich? A lot of farmers that are practicing the style of regenerative agriculture will claim they're growing more nutrient dense food. And Ann and I, my wife, who wrote The Hidden Half of Nature with me, and I are working on a new book now trying to basically address that very question. Do these practices that can rebuild the health and fertility of the land, can they also improve the quality of the food that we eat? In other words, can we not only farm for high yield, but can we get high quality at the same time as we get high yield? And it's very clear that there's been declines in the micronutrient concentration in foods in the second half of the 20th century. The iron content of our livestock and our crops, the zinc content, things that you don't think that we really need to eat a lot of. I mean, you don't think about eating zinc all the time, right?
Right.
But it's really essential for the enzyme functions that keep you healthy. So you don't need a lot of it, but you sure need it a lot. And yet the zinc levels in our food have dropped radically in the last 50 years. So you've got to eat, 2 or 3 times the vegetables to get the same amount. And what are we not eating as much of? Well, vegetables. We're eating a lot more simple sugars. So the nature of our diet has changed a lot. But the question we're wrestling with in the new book is not only how have those dietary changes affected our health, but how have the farming practices that influence what's in the food that we eat, how much does that matter to human health? And we've got every reason to believe at this point that there's connections, and it's not as simple as organic versus conventional. I mean, the studies that have looked at those differences have found sort of all over the map kind of results, in part because of the way those kind of meta studies where you go to the library and just vacuum up studies and go, well, how many people said this? How many people said that? Those often have real shortcomings in terms of what's actually hidden behind the veil. How did they define organic? How did they define conventional? And as we've been discussing, those labels don't translate necessarily into better soil health or worse soil health, because there's conventional farms I could take you to that I write about in Growing a Revolution, where the soil quality is amazing. And they don't use much in the way of agrochemicals, but they're still conventional because they will use some fertilizer every third year or something, and maybe they'll use some herbicide every third year. So they're not organic, but their soil quality and I believe their food quality is superb. And there's other, large-scale organic farms that aren't necessarily building soil health. So those simple labels, the things we can actually see at a grocery store as a label, don't necessarily translate into soil health. So what we want to wrestle with in the new book is the question of, is soil health the right metric to think about in terms of evaluating not only our ability to maintain high harvests into the future, but our ability to make sure that those harvests are packed with the nutrients that we need, the mineral micronutrients and the plant-made phytochemicals. And those are the two things that really farming practices we think can actually have a big impact on, that we know are connected to human health. But it's complicated. I mean, think of all the things that go into our health, and then think of all the things that go into the health of a plant, and then all the dots that you connect to get from the one to the other. It's a complicated system. So we're going to wrestle with that over the next year or so and see what we come up with, because we want to see where are the good studies, where does the data actually lead us, what can you say with confidence, and that's in the back of each of the books that we've written. There's a thick section of sources and references. We try and make sure that the stuff that we're writing about and arguing about is not just our own opinions, but it's backed up by others' experience.
That sounds like a fascinating project. I can't wait to read that book. Sounds really good. Do you have any final words for our listeners? Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I encourage people to think about, if you're worried about, what kind of food to eat yourself, one of the best ways is to try and tie in with farmers that the practices that they're actually doing. Farmers markets are great places, and they're not always expensive. In Seattle, we've got a lot of options now that we didn't have 10 years ago. So I think those options are increasing for people in different areas. And we should encourage farmers who are adopting soil health building practices in those environments. And if you're interested in following what we're doing, Ann and I are active on Twitter. Our handle is @dig2grow. So dig, the number 2, grow. And we have a website, dig2grow.com, where if you're interested in our books, whether it's Dirt, The Hidden Half of Nature, or Growing a Revolution, we've got descriptions of them up there that you could sort of see which one you might be interested in, or get a preview of them. Feel free to check them out there. They're available pretty much anywhere you can get books. People can order them. I encourage people to think about the soil beneath your feet as something other than dirt, because it's a lot more interesting than that, and it's absolutely critical to the future of civilization, really, that we get the soil problem right this time.
I absolutely agree. Dave, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
No worries, Mateo. Pleasure to talk to you.
So that was David Montgomery, the author of Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. After talking to Dave, I had a look over my notes and I came across a quote that I wrote down from his book that really, for me, sums up what this agricultural revolution is all about and why it's so important. So I thought I'd share this quote with you just as a final thought for further reflection. The debate over the future of agriculture is misrepresented when cast as the simple choice between organic methods on the one hand and agrotech approaches like GMOs on the other. It really comes down to the philosophical rift between agricultural practices based on enhancing nutrient cycling and soil health versus those that mine soil fertility and attempt to replace or compensate for degraded soil health with tech and commercial products. All too often, the latter makes short-term economic sense once the soil is already degraded. Therein lies the real dilemma of our modern crisis. The immediate financial interests of corporations that supply farmers do not necessarily align with our collective interest in maintaining the health and fertility of our agricultural soils. That is it for now, guys. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to support the podcast, as always, you can subscribe and rate, review via iTunes. You can also, of course, share the podcast with friends and family and follow what we're up to on all our social media platforms. That's on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The social media handles for all of those platforms are For Food's Sake Me. You can also stream all of the episodes via our website, www.forfoodsake.me. Or if you're a regular podcast listener, you can of course find the podcast on any of your regular podcast apps. Goodbye for now, Merry Christmas, and I'll see you next time.